All right, guys, welcome up Brian Hill.
Nope.
Nope.
Welcome up.
Oh my gosh, Chandra. Chandra, come up.
Definitely.
I told you I'd miss something. This is more important than Brian and way better too. Okay, we tell stories of what's going on in our lives in all kinds of ways. If it has to do with what God's doing with things that we're doing as part of Oak House, or just, hey, tell us your story. And so Chandra Kinney is up here to just say, what has God done in your life? What's your story? What's your testimony? So take it away. Do you want to use this?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, like Chad said, I'm Chandra, and this is my story. And I have to read just to keep me in the time frame and all that kind of stuff. So, I once was aimless and confused and lost and lonely. I grew up in a fairly stable, secular family, but we had zero moral guidelines or expectations, and the home environment was completely absent of expressions of any love. I often wondered what would happen if I ever said, I love you, to my mom or my dad, but I was always too scared to even try to do that, so I never did that as a kid. So I figured out, or I got this lesson that I needed to seek love and affirmation elsewhere. I was also sexually abused by an uncle as a kid, which added on another warped and broken layer to that lesson that maybe I should be seeking love and affirmation through romantic relationships, sexual relationships, and find my value there. Then I was introduced to Jesus. Early in my freshman year of high school, my maternal grandmother passed away, and she had asked to be buried in her homeland. And so my mom and all her sisters and her brother went to Vietnam for 4 weeks. During that time, my parents arranged for each of me and my siblings to be at a friend's house after school. And then my dad picked us up after work. So for 4 weeks, I got to go to my best friend's house after school. And our relationship really deepened during that time. And she was a Christian. And so we had a really close friendship, and she ended up inviting me to youth group, where I found a community of really loving people, the leaders and the other students. And I learned that the creator of the universe sees me, knows me, and loves me. By the time I got to go to winter camp in February, I hadn't really thought about making an actual choice to follow Jesus, but the choice was presented at camp. Surprise. And at that time, I was like, oh, this is an obvious choice, but based on what I've learned, I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I made that choice. Things got a little messy at home. I still wanted to make my family proud and everything, but being poured into by my youth leaders, in particular one named Laura, was huge in encouraging me. And at one point, my older half-brother, he's 13 years older than me, came home to visit. He did, sew a few times a year, and we ended up talking and figured out that he had been introduced to Jesus a few years back by his girlfriend in college. And he had made a choice to follow Jesus, and his girlfriend eventually became his fiancée. She passed away before they were able to get married, but he leaned into his faith, and Jesus carried him through that. And so I was really just encouraged by getting to hear how he had been growing in his faith. So I've been growing in my relationship with him. Now I have an identity. I know in the depth of my soul that I'm loved. I know where the true source of love is and what true love is. I recognize the very unhealthy path that I was on, and I'm filled with gratitude. And I'm still in awe that he pursued me, and he cares about the minor details of my life, and that he asks me to be a part of what he's doing.
Hey, Chandra, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So you talked about being aimless, all that kind of stuff, and then the pain that you experienced. If someone was out there and they didn't think those things could ever be overcome, and it's really hard to see the other side, what would you tell them to do? Like if they're here this morning or listening and they feel that hopelessness, or like there's no way me, what do you have any encouragement, or what would you advise?
Well, of course, everyone's story is different. But I think just facing it, reaching out for help from, people that you trust, and giving it to God. It does heal.
That's it. That's good. Thank you, Chandra. You guys, can we thank her? Great job. I love it when we get to tell stories of what God's doing outside of just the people who are teaching. Chandra, you have so much courage. Thank you. You're such a strong follower of Christ. All right, take out your Bibles. We're second from the last week in 2 Samuel. And if you need a Bible, raise your hand. The ushers are going to come down and hand you one.
Good morning, everybody. Just want to say again, you're most welcome here if you're new to our church, if this is your first time. Anna, you're back there. Did you pick her story on purpose? Okay. I'm listening to John's story for the first time to hear it in some of the detail, and I'm going, oh my goodness, the way this is mapping with what we're going to be doing today feels really important. And I just assumed that was all planned by us, but it appears that it was planned by God. So last week, if you were here, I had a Jenga analogy, specifically about David building his kingdom, and how that every once in a while, he was building his kingdom, but also creating gaps in the foundation. He was doing things, he was saying things, he was participating in life events that were actually, maybe by some standards, building upwards, but also weakening. And so this week, we're going to talk about some of the ripple impacts of what was going on, not just in this building, but also in the failures. So I want to go through a technical piece really quickly. And here's the technical piece. There's this term, chiasmus. Go ahead and say it back to me. Chiasmus. So a chiasmus is a literary device that's often used in the Hebrew Scriptures, and what it does is it basically uses a set of events, even words in a sentence, and all this stuff that has kind of a fulcrum moment, and then it reflects those in sometimes and mostly counter ways. And so what we see in 2 Samuel very specifically is we see a chiasmus occurring throughout the passage. So what you have is the first 10 chapters of David building his kingdom. Okay? And then in chapters 11 and 12, what we see is we see David's failure. We talked about that last week. We see adultery, we see murder, we see deception, we see all of these things. And so then the chapters that we're going to look at today are the reflection, the opposite reflection of everything that we saw in the upward space. And so the next chapters that we read, the next 10 in fact, are basically the downfall, the heartbreak, the wake of sin from David's experience and David's life that all of a sudden bring his entire house down. So I'm going to try and summarize 10 chapters with a 10-act play. Okay, I'm not going to enact it. I am just going to talk about it. Okay, so don't get stressed out. So I could do it in a British accent, and I thought about doing some stuff, but I decided not to. All right, David's firstborn, the heir apparent to the throne, Amnon, is obsessed with his half-sister Tamar. If you'll remember, David had many wives and even many more children. And so Amnon all of a sudden is obsessed with his half-sister and decides that he wants her sexually. He conspires to come up with a plan to be able to have her, and this plan is actually enacted by his cousin and also his sister's cousin. Amnon is alone with his sister and he makes sexual advances of her. She resists and fights back. But the passage tells us that Amnon was stronger than Tamar, and he sexually assaults her. David is furious about it, and Tamar's full-blood brother, because the half-brother is the one who abuses her, her full-blood brother, Absalom, hates his other brother for what he did to his sister. Absalom devises a plan to get revenge, and in doing so, murders his half-brother. Absalom then goes and flees the kingdom to go be with his grandfather for 3 years because he's afraid of what David, the king, and also his dad and Tamar's dad and Amnon's dad might do. the tower gets weaker and weaker. David finally decides to send a messenger after 3 years to go get Absalom from his grandfather and says, come home, can have a relationship with you. But when he invites him home, he doesn't just stay, he doesn't invite his son there to see him, to have a conversation, either a good one or a bad one. But instead, what happens is for 2 years, Absalom is returned to the kingdom and lives in his own house, and David never meets with him. Amnon convenes some fighting forces because he is furious with his dad and he hates every piece of what his dad stands for. The soldier with David's army lets David know that in the events that happen of Absalom trying to overtake the kingdom, a coup happens, and Absalom somehow gets hung in a tree by his hair. He's riding his horse and he goes under a branch and he gets hung. And while he's suspended in midair, David's general kills him. And we're told that David returns back to Jerusalem after all of this, brokenhearted and undone. Palace intrigue continues, and another rival faction rises up. Murder and battles continue, further weakening David's kingdom and bringing his house down. So what we want to do is look at some of these instances in particular. So there's a lot going on, obviously. There are two themes that feel really important as we start to look at what's taking place in these passages, specifically around David, his sin, and the repercussions that we see throughout it. The two themes that I've noticed throughout this entire passage is violence and avoidance, which seem contradictory, but at the same time, that's what it seems like in the passage. The first act of violence that we see in this initial one is sexual assault. The story of sexual assault of Tamar is one of the most troubling texts in Scripture. The pathology of Amnon in assaulting his sister is troubling. The pathos in Tamar's pleas with her attacker, including an offer even to marry him, are both moving and disturbing. David's failure to act, any action, is appalling. As much as we sympathize with Tamar and understand Absalom's yearning for revenge, his plan is cold-blooded murder. What is more, the story doesn't provide any role models which modern Christians should emulate. Amnon's assault, David's failure to act, and Absalom's violence are all horrific. For those who read the Bible expecting inspirational stories, this may be a bit of a shock, leading the reader to question why it's included in the first place. So if you are new to our community, if this is your first time, this is a lot. And one of the things that we've been doing and going through 1st and 2nd Samuel is we've been trying to honor the text at every point and not just shy away from some of the things that feel hard or feel painful or feel troubling or feel really confusing. Because what we believe is that the authors of the Bible have said this stuff on purpose. And so what we're asked to do, what we're called into doing, is to figure out what on earth is happening. And so the violence of sexual assault is talked about at the beginning of this downfall of the house of David. But that's not even the only instance. There's another instance later where when Absalom is coming in through the coup to take over and kill David, his soldiers, and his house all flee both the palace and Jerusalem to get away from the oncoming assault. David has many women outside of the women that he has already married that are specifically there just for his sexual pleasure. And those women in particular are left in the palace. And one of the authors that I was reading this week said that David chooses to leave the palace, but these women were not given a choice, and they're made to stay. And as Absalom comes in to the palace and does all of this, he's given advice specifically from one of his advisors that says, if you want to show your dominance over your father, show your dominance over these women. And there's this wild passage where it has already been stated back when Nathan confronts David with his sin and says there are going to be repercussions. And one of the things that Nathan says is, there will be women who are close to you. There will be your second wives, and they will actually be sexually assaulted in public. And it happens here. Absalom, a man who was trying to get revenge for his sister's sexual assault, then assaults all of these women, these sisters, these daughters. This is not the only instance of sexual violence that's perpetrated against women that's recorded in Scripture. Their survivor accounts bear witness not only to the way that women were treated, but cry out, this should not be. We need help and hope and restoration. Obviously, this is not something that's only historical. We know this. The statistics of these violent acts are unimaginable. LA County, just this past Thursday, I don't know, maybe you saw this in the news, announced a $4 billion settlement to pay out 6,800 victims of sexual abuse. If your own story is reflective of Tamar's, I'm so sorry. We at Oak House want to be a place that offers space to mourn, people to support, and opportunities for healing. If you've been here a while, hopefully you've seen that we're not interested in Christian piety or platitudes that add insult to pain. If you're new here, if you're ever ready to invite us into your story, we want to listen. We want to mourn. We want to be with you. So we see the violence in this passage, but we also see avoidance, specifically around sexual assault. Why on earth is this included in the Bible? Well, I think, again, counter to the avoidance that we're going to look at in a second, the writer specifically says this happened, and we're going to get it down, because there is something that we need to know both about humanity and something about God. It exposes the wake and the pain of sin. The author wants an account for all of David. He wants an account for the 10 chapters of Rise and the ways in which he followed God, even in the midst of pulling different spaces that weakened his base. There are all of these beautiful moments where we go, David gets it. But then there are all of these repercussive actions that take place as well. And the author is not just only interested in sharing the good stuff. Thank God that the Bible gives us a relatable example of what it means to be human, even in the most painful places. It highlights that concerns regarding violence against women have to be talked about and have to be dealt with. But here's the dilemma. This hasn't always been. Yeah, newsflash. But guess what? It hasn't always been, even specifically in church and specifically with church leadership. These are actual quotes from 2 commentaries that I read specifically about this particular passage. The first one is this: we have here a particular account of an abominable wickedness of Amnon in ravishing his sister, a subject not fit to be enlarged on, nor indeed to be mentioned without blushing. We're not going to talk about it. Another commentary that literally goes verse by verse. It says verse 1, and then it has some stuff to say. Verse 2, and it has some stuff to say. This is what this commentator says specifically about the verse right before this instance. There is no use to read the next few verses, which contain the sordid details of what happened. And the commentary skips to verse 17. Doesn't mention it at all. But this is not the way that it should be in the Bible. This is not the way that it should be with the people of the Bible or people of Jesus. Proverbs 31 verse 8 tells us that we need to be a voice for those who have no voice. Ensure justice for those being crushed. The longer that I've sat in this passage, the longer that I continue to see this is a justice passage. People crying out for justice. A people Not just of the people specific to the events, but a people group saying, we need more. We need more. We need hope. We need healing. David as king and David as dad showcase avoidance. His own sin and possible shame may have kept him from doing anything about this terrible moment. The author wants all of the readers, however, to notice that there is one person who doesn't remain silent, and that's Tamar herself. Tamar advocates for herself. She is the only voice that speaks in all of this tragedy. She puts ashes on her head to show that she's mourning, that she's brokenhearted, that she's downcast. And so a lot of people would have been asking, who died? What's wrong? And what she goes on to do after she puts ashes on her head is she tears her princess robe. There was this robe that was beautiful that she would wear to showcase the fact that she was a princess of the kingdom, but also that she was a virgin. Her virginity was a big deal to society and to all the people, specifically for whoever it is that would be her husband at some point. And so when she puts ashes on her head, she showcases, I am mourning. And when people ask who died, she would say, I did. My virginity has been lost. This is troubling. So what's God up to in the midst of all this? Here's another quote from a commentary. The close connection between these events and the prophetic indictment in the previous chapter may lead the reader to wonder, what's God's role in all of this terrible events? Was Tamar's assault intentionally part of God's purpose in disciplining David for his sin? Nathan's prophetic word to David, however, says nothing about Tamar and her abuse. Clearly, in this story, it is lust and violence of Amnon that causes it to happen. And it is David's lack of action that exacerbates the problem. The free choice of human characters in the story are to blame, not God. When sin brings consequences, we cannot lay blame for them at the feet of God. I had a conversation this week with somebody who was saying, this passage is super difficult for me. And I'm like, yeah, you think? But specifically, they were saying, where's God's place in this? What's God up to? And I think that we can look into the passage and we can see God lifting up Tamar's story through the fact that she's listed here. Again, the author has it set in their heart to say, we will tell her story. But also God doesn't end there. He doesn't end with just saying, we're going to tell her story and be reminded of it. And she's actually followed in the lineage of Jesus. But we're also going to have Jesus come and reverse all of the ways in which women are treated. The abuse, the avoidance, they're going to be upended and turned over because of who Jesus is and because of his embodiment of what it means for him to be loved. John 4, he breaks so many social norms with the Samaritan woman for her to be seen and to be the evangelist for her community. Literally, he says, I see you in all of your whatever you have going on, and I'm choosing you to tell about me to your entire community. John chapter 8, one thing among many that Jesus does is highlight the hypocrisy of the religious leaders when they only bring a woman caught in the act of adultery. Where's the dude? And Jesus stands in front of her, dignifies her, and calls her both away from sin and into more. The next violence that it seems is overwhelming in this passage, if we go back to our themes of violence and avoidance, is murder itself. This is not simply kind of the war culture that we talked about several times throughout the series, but this is the sins of the father being amplified by his children. Generational sin is a real thing. We see all of these things that have been done here, either David did or David let happen. Ambition may also have been a part of the murder. Amnon was the heir apparent, and it's conceivable, especially as we continue to read about the palace intrigue and Absalom's coup, that Absalom sees the abuse of his sister as a way to move into the pole position for the crown by murdering his brother. One commentator actually refers to this entire section as the succession narrative, the fight, the deception, and the violence to acquire the throne. It seems like that the violence also can look to the lack of trust that these people have in others and in God. Things aren't going my way, so I'm going to kill to get it. I'm hurt, so lashing out is an acceptable response. We see a lack of empathy in this passage, but we see that God is different, not just through the Hebrew Scriptures, but also through Jesus. So many times in the Hebrew Scriptures, God reminds his people of his slowness to anger, his generous blessing, and his grace in the midst of rebellion. The second half, the second theme of the avoidance, specifically is called out in David again. Again, he does nothing. David, the king, doesn't protect his nation. There's a coup, there's intrigue and plots all abounding, and he does nothing about it. And then David as dad, again, does not protect his children. A son murders a son. And this calls to the fact that we need to deal with sin in the moment. There are all of these situations where we, in our own interest of building kingdom, in our own interest of saving face, continue to pull bricks, continue to add things or take away things into the deepest places of our character that erode our foundation from where it truly should be. But Jesus, as God, pushes against murder, against hate, both in the violence and the avoidance. Jesus not only cites the Hebrew law not to murder, but he calls out hate and commands us to love his enemies. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 45. You have heard that it is said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of the Father of heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. I think a lot of times we can read this passage and the downfall of David and go, well, that doesn't directly apply to me because I didn't murder anybody yesterday, and at least I'm not planning on it later. And I think that we can just kind of push that aside and not recognize both the sin that brought him to this place, the inattention that brought his family to this place. And what Jesus calls out here is, yeah, you may not be murdering, although that's bad, but what are the ways in which you're compromising your conscience, you're compromising your heart, you're compromising what it means to be love and to show love? He doesn't fight either. When his disciples are ready to fight for his behalf, this is what's recorded in Matthew 26. Then a man steps forward, a Roman soldier steps forward to seize Jesus and arrest him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reaches for his sword, draws it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus says to him. And then maybe even considering the downfall of David's home. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? The security, the understanding of what it looks like to love those who push against you is all embodied in Jesus. And I want to talk specifically about David as a dad for just a minute. We've seen these examples of where he avoids the assault of his daughter and doesn't do anything about it. We've seen the example of where his son kills his other son and he doesn't do anything about it. And another example of this is Absalom. So after Absalom has murdered his brother and then flees to his grandfather for 3 years, finally David is sort of tricked into having Absalom come back into the kingdom. And so he sort of begrudgingly, it certainly seems, it says, Absalom, you can come home. So Absalom comes home. But then for 2 years, David doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't speak to him. He doesn't see him. He doesn't invite him to the palace. And Absalom, through some aspect of contempt over the rejection that he's feeling, burns down one of David's advisors' field to basically get David's attention, and finally David brings him into the palace. But how many times can we relate to a loved one giving us the silent treatment? a son acting out to get his dad's attention. This is not simply a childhood activity. Robert Bly actually states it this way, specific to significant male voices in his life. Never being welcomed into the male world by older men is a wound to my chest. Kendrick Lamar has these words in his song, Father Time. I come from a generation of home invasions. I got daddy issues. That's on me. Everything them four walls has taught me made habits buried deep. That man knew a lot, but not enough to keep me past them streets. My life is a plot twisted from directions that I can't see. I think many of us, most of us, have had moments of joy and moments of pain with male role models in our lives. And maybe even specifically fathers. Maybe specifically dads. And when I was reading specifically and considering the avoidance of David in all of his different accounts and the ways in which David is a dad in his home, can you guys figure out what kind of home life this would have been for them growing up? David has 6+ wives. He's got more just women on the side. Some say that David may have had like 30-something children. What was it like growing up in that home? What was it like trying to get your dad's attention? What was it like for them to go, can I just talk to the king for a minute? Among all of my brothers and sisters, among all the other stuff that he has going on. None of these individuals get where they are in a minute. There's this phrase that goes along with personal finance that says, bankruptcy happens all at once and over a very long time. The downfall of David's house happened at once and over a really long period of time and has so much carnage buried inside of it. When I think about David the dad, I was also reminded of the contrast that we see in Luke 15 with a dad. This dad's son tells the entire community that he wishes that his dad was already dead so that he could just live his life. The dad, though for sure embarrassed and heartbroken at all of these events that transpire, waits for his son's hopeful return, not knowing for sure if he ever will. The story goes on to say that while still a long way off, the dad sees his son and throws off all societal norms to run to his son and greet him with the celebration fitting for a prince who has returned. David brings the prince home, the heir apparent at this point, and refuses to see him. And a father who has had a coup attempt in his own home, sees his son a long way away and runs to him and kisses him and throws a party. This has been talked about a lot over the history of the church, but there are so many ways in which our relationship with our dads start to impact our relationship with how we think of God the Father. I was hanging out with someone who was trying to figure out Christianity, and they were really hurt and had a lot of wounds that had built up over the course of time. And they said, when I read the Bible, all I can see is God being a pissed off drunk. And it was because that is all that they knew. One of the other aspects that we see is violence and avoidance in church. The Barna Group has recently shown that there is a significant rise in people that claim no faith at all. We as leaders of Oak House have and will continue to confront individuals who harm our community. We want to make sure that you're cared for. And if there are people in here that are interested in undoing this house, then we're not going to let that happen. We will not avoid it. But hopefully we'll do it in love. We'll do it in grace. We'll do it in an invitation to be restored. And we've also put processes in place all the way in our bylaws, specifically about how we want to protect Oak House from her leaders. There's plenty of places where it's like, okay, like we're going to take care of them, the bad people out there, but never have any self-reflection to realize that maybe the enemy is from within. And specifically, when we were setting up Oak House way back in the day, we had a retreat where we started working through the bylaws, and we specifically had in mind some of the situations in which church leaders were significant influences in horrible ways in the downfall of local communities. And there were all of these holy moments where we're going, we want to write things in such a way, and we want to put protectionary measures in place in certain ways so that Oak House, the people, are protected even from leaders who would go sideways. And I remember specifically, there was a moment when we were talking about it, and the statement was said, let's not just take care of Oak House right now, let's take care of Oak House 50 years from now. You're cared for and you're loved by people who are trying as hard as they can to love and to care and to shepherd you well. And so yes, we know that the church has scandals, but here's what I want to say. The church is not her scandals. There are faithful men and women who have followed Jesus for their whole lives, often in obscurity, who will never have a podcast, they'll never write a book, but will be honored by Jesus, the King, as good and faithful servants. I was thinking about your story and your friend. I don't know, maybe she's super famous, but it's people like that, right? I mean, and we all probably have someone in our lives that live in somewhat obscure existence as it pertains to following Jesus. If you're new to our community, you will hear us say on repeat, we are a group of people who will make mistakes and continue to prove that we need a Savior. Come with us. So the church, I want you to hear loud and clear, is not her scandals. Yes, there are scandalous acts that happen, but she is not her scandals. But here's what I want you to hear specifically about you. You are not your scandals. In the same way that I refuse to give the church an identity of her scandals, I won't do it to you either. Be here in your pain, your questions, your doubts and fears, and all the ways that you're currently blowing it. And we will be a community who reminds you that you are more than what you've done and more of what you can be. Come with us. Last thing, and I want to invite the band up. As I've been thinking through a lot of this stuff, and again, this even ties, Chandra, into what you were talking about. There are ways to read through all of this and just sit in despair. And there are ways to sit through this and to just be in grief. The way that I want to kind of describe despair is like this. It's like sitting in a cave where the entrance is sealed. No way for light to get in. No way to remove yourself from the situation. But grief, especially grief that's rooted in Jesus, that's rooted in a community of faith. Grief is like lighting a candle at night with the anticipation of fire from the morning sun. And this is the place that we get to be invited into right now. Not a place of despair, not a place without hope, but at the same time, a space and a place for you to grieve well, to grieve deeply, and for us to say, we'll light a candle with you and we'll wait on the sun. So what do we do when we find ourselves in this pile of rubble of our own actions or of the actions of others? We look to Jesus and live a hope-filled anticipation of his kingdom. Someone in our life group said this week that because of this series, their anticipation for Easter has just been heightened so much. And I know for me it has too. Like we continue to talk about the coming king, and especially through the carnage of what we see in the second half of 2 Samuel, we all cry out, God, where are you? God, where are you? And God says, I'm right here. I came into the deepest places of humanity. And I showed what it truly means to be human in all of its flourishing. And I'm inviting you into that. And from that place, be filled with my presence so that you can be reminded of light in the dark places and so that you can also encourage others in those dark places. And so we want to respond. And for this first song, this is just an opportunity for you to just have that conversation with God that he's been stirring in you. And there are a lot of possible plot points, even in what we've talked about, where he would want to speak or where he is speaking. And the way that we do that around here is we just take some time. And so we want to take time during this first song to just continue that conversation. Active listening, Chad talks about all the time. What are you saying? Did I hear you correctly? And what would you have me do about it? And then we'll respond in another way after this song.